Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't a happy story. It's not a story about heroes. It's a story of retribution, of confronting your faults as the world crumbles around you. The story that Rockstar built is gaming's most robust attempt at tragedy. The Shakespearean kind, with a tragic hero brought down by his own failings, the world around them laid to ruin as a result of their own mistakes. When you finish Red Dead Redemption 2, you're left with a profound feeling of loss as you mourn everything you and Arthur just went through. It's a game that sticks the landing, and is how it became such a modern favorite of narrative gameplay. Rockstar may know how to end a tragedy, but is that enough to forgive the fact that they don't know how to set one up? Or that Rockstar's gameplay and tragedy may simply be incompatible? More often than not, you know if you're entering into a tragedy at the beginning. Romeo and Juliet tells you right off the bat, hey, these two die in the end. Hamlet establishes death in the first scene with talk of the king's ghost. It is what preyed on Gatsby, past tense hinting that Gatsby is no more. Lear opens by literally going over his will. Those first few moments are what builds the foundation for the rest of the story. You've got to get a lot of information to the audience really fast, so you've got to find ways to establish character, world, tone, theme, and conflict. This is why many stories, especially genre fiction not set in the modern real world, star fresh-faced amnesiacs or sheltered children that learn about the world at the same pace as the audience. For contrast, Disco Elysium is a game with a similar main character to Arthur that takes this approach. Another trickier method is to start a story in media res, or in the middle, where the characters have already been together for some time and are already in the middle of the action. The benefit of this technique is that it establishes conflict quickly and gives more fully formed characters quick opportunities to show who they are. Red Dead Redemption 2 throws the audience right in the middle, with the Vanderlyn gang lost in the mountains running away from the law after a botched robbery. Set aside that if you played the first game, you'll recognize some of these characters quickly and apply that baggage to them. New players, like myself, will have no idea who these people are beyond what was on the box, and that wasn't much. But around the gang is the weight of defeat. Death looming as we learn that several of their own are freshly dead, and the stage for a tragedy is set. This is the part where I have to admit that this is my first Rockstar game. Obviously, I know about Grand Theft Auto and their other properties, but I had to do a little bit of research about generally what style of game they make. Rockstar's primary objective, gameplay-wise, seems rooted in immersion and player choice that's free of moral judgment. They want to make complex worlds where the player is free to explore and do anything they want as the ultimate sandbox. Well, if that thing is usually crime or otherwise deviant behavior, but no judging. And that's great world building and immersion if that's the kind of story you want to play out. Personally, it's not my cup of tea. I'd rather beat up giant demons than terrorize NPCs just minding their business, but all of the praise to RDR2's brilliant narrative for years and years was enough for me to boot it up. Quickly, we are introduced to our protagonist, Arthur, and the rest of the gang in media res. We know they're criminals, and not very good ones, presumably, if they're running from a fumbled job, but the rest is up to us to learn. You feel pretty quickly that these people have long histories together, and because they already know what they mean to each other, they don't often talk about the past in ways that is easily accessible to the audience. This is a powerful technique for immersion, because it grounds the world in its own reality independent of the player. In writing, you'll often get the advice, show, don't tell, meaning you'll get more mileage out of showing a character's feelings through actions, not by just telling the audience above board that a character thinks or feels a certain thing. In media res kind of relies on the opposite, tell, don't show, because everything in the past already happened and can only be talked about. Shakespeare actually also relies on telling in early scenes, usually setting the story up with a minor character talking about the state of things to another minor character. Show can be used in this setup with devices like flashbacks, but Red Dead Redemption 2 never uses this, opting for devices like diegetic conversations on horseback throughout the game to talk about any backstory that occurred before we, the audience, join the gang. Aside from Arthur, the biggest character we meet at this point is Dutch Vanderlyn, the leader of the gang. He's handsome, charismatic, and obviously respected deeply by those who follow him. He preaches that he will save them from this mess.
Stay with me.
His most loyal supporter is Arthur Morgan, who fully believes in this group they've built.
Dutch saved me. Saved most of us. That's why we need to stick by him through this. He always sees us right.
This complete faith in Dutch is extremely important. For the first chapter of the game, as we escape the mountains, we're introduced to a few characters more in depth, like Charles and John. We learn about the Vanderlyn gang's ongoing rivalry with the O'Driscoll gang, and we rob a train to get some money to get back on our feet. We're drip-fed the bare minimum about these characters, given a vague objective of get enough money to escape the law. It's never really clear what the next step is, but Dutch asks us to have faith in him, as he figures out a way to save everybody. By now, I hope you've picked up that Arthur Morgan is our hero, though it's not obvious yet that he's a tragic hero. See, every tragic hero has a flaw that brings about their downfall. Hamlet's is indecision, Lear's is pride, and Arthur's is loyalty. Specifically, his loyalty to Dutch. The game uses a few strategies in chapters 1 and 2 to try and build up some of that trust around Dutch for the player. Dutch and Arthur are willing to brave the storm to look for their missing friends and implying selflessness. Dutch and Arthur take in Sadie after she's widowed by the rival O'Driscoll gang, which implies heroism. Dutch's opening speech does inspire a sense of family and prioritization of their needs in this dangerous situation. We learn that Dutch took in an orphaned Arthur under his wing when he was young, and Arthur looks up to him as a mentor and family. Dutch often brings Arthur into his personal confidence, showing a level of trust that makes us and Arthur feel special and chosen. Arthur resents John, who was similarly taken in by Dutch, for abandoning the gang and his family for a year, while Arthur didn't take that same chance when given the option. Dutch has a sense of paternalism by calling Arthur son and often shows huge worry whenever anyone at camp is hurt or missing. He dresses well, he quotes philosophy, he plays opera around the camp. He built the gang around a relatively moral code, which is how Dutch won over Hosea. Things like no harming women and children, don't rob those that can't afford it, only take from those that rob others, very Robin Hood. And it can also be fun to see him lie to those outside the fold, false names and backstories easily sliding from his tongue, but we know better. We are on the inside. All of these are the game's attempts to show you who Dutch is and win you over, playing on your emotions around family in order to try and catch you up on how Arthur feels about Dutch. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't a game that wants to give you easy answers. It isn't interested in spelling out its world for you, the player, instead highlighting how Arthur would move through the world as someone native to it. This goes back to Rockstar's core philosophy around wanting to build these deeply immersive and free worlds. And like we've already covered, this means that it's more difficult to find information on what the gang was like before the Blackwater incident, the job that went wrong in the beginning. Well, and difficult may be the wrong word, because characters like Hosea will just up and tell you if you happen to be in the right place at the right time. But because it's a story that Arthur knows because he lived it, the game is designed so that you as the player have to work especially hard to discover that story through environmental storytelling and listening closely. In a book, play, or any directly linear story, the audience is guaranteed to encounter information in the order intended by the author. This means that setup can be carefully crafted, so plot point A impacts plot point B, impacts plot point C, etc. But Rockstar takes a leap of faith in how Red Dead Redemption 2's narrative would play out by prioritizing its open-ended world to preserve their dedication to immersion. Consequently, that means that they have to hope that the player will catch on to that formula and play slowly and explore, either because they already know how Rockstar games work or they pick it up through context. But sometimes a leap of faith doesn't pay off. If you play Red Dead Redemption 2 like you'd play other similar games, focusing on story missions and running around the world in between, you miss out on these subtle story moments happening at camp. It feels like these huge lore drops happen while Arthur isn't around. A lot of players will just listen to the main mission, which is go out and make money, and so they'll go do that. So if you do what the game tells you to do, and you don't slow down and sit around camp, it can take a long time to clue into how this story works, especially in the early game. This was a huge gamble to take. In any branching game, player agency is a huge wild card in how a narrative is presented, especially in worlds like this that are designed to give the player flexibility. It's already a difficult element to work around in a story that is actually willing to establish backstory in the main quest. And backstory is necessary for a tragedy to work. Loss only works if you've lost something that you cared deeply about. So the audience needs to understand how deep that loss is for the character, but even better if they can attach their own feelings to the tragic heroes and feel that loss for their own sorrows. This is a fundamental element of why tragedy works. It's called catharsis. It's that feeling of calm after a good cry that makes you feel a little more in control of things. Feeling that loss through a story gives you a venue to feel things that you may be suppressing or mourning in your own life. It's why many of our oldest stories are tragedies. You can argue either way for whose fault this gap of information is in Red Dead Redemption 2. It's the player's fault for not putting in the work to slow down and uncover this backstory, or it's Rockstar's fault for not establishing more of their groundwork in the main missions. As a player, I lean more towards irritation at Rockstar because this method was actively detrimental to my overall experience for reasons we will get into. But as a writer, I do respect what they were trying to do and mostly feel that it was a lot of good intention working against lots of conditioning from other games. Because unless everything goes perfectly, your silver bullet ends up hitting you in the foot. Like, okay, 2 other open world games with lots of environmental storytelling is Elden Ring and Witcher 3. Now, almost everyone misses almost everything about Elden Ring's story during gameplay because it's another game that doesn't want to give easy answers, burying lore and item descriptions and brief character interactions, but that feels okay because you don't go to Elden Ring for a deep narrative experience. You're there to kill gods, and your Tarnished does not have to know or care about most of anything as long as they get to be Elden Lord. On the other hand, Witcher 3 is billed as a narrative game with a character that already has a lifetime of lore and 2 games post-amnesia with this world. While the world building is dense, and if you're anything like me, you ignored a good chunk of the political stuff, Witcher 3 ensures that if Geralt knows about something, you can get caught up pretty quickly as it becomes relevant and if desired. And the reason I'm being so harsh about Red Dead Redemption 2 is because the one thing I'd always heard about it was how brilliant the story is, so I have high expectations for it. So the effect of all of this in-game is that for many players who don't or won't hunt for every crumb of backstory by digging through everyone's stuff and sitting by the fire, the main missions of Chapter 2 are meant to establish how you understand the state of the gang, more or less. This is the best shape we see the group in throughout the game. They're tired, broke, and reeling from a failed job in Blackwater. We have to assume that this is more or less business as usual for these folks, doing small jobs around an area to bring in enough money for whatever Dutch is planning next. But even in this life that seems difficult and deadly, every person in that camp sticks around because of Dutch and where he leads them. And he definitely, absolutely, for sure has a plan. He's working on it, but he's not ready to tell anyone yet, asking for more faith. We've already brought up the main objective of the game at this point that Dutch gave you. Work to get enough money for us to escape the law. But because Dutch is keeping his cards close to his chest and we, the player, don't have a lot of context, there's a lot of gaps to fill in. Where are we trying to escape to? How much do we need? This becomes another test of loyalty. Less so between Arthur and Dutch, but between Dutch and the player. As Dutch's big role in the gang is to be the mastermind, while Arthur and the others serve as the muscle, Arthur trusts that Dutch is really coming up with a plan to save them all. And the player is taken along for the ride, no matter how directionless it feels to us. If Steam achievements are anything to be believed, this is where a startling number of people dropped off, meaning that loyalty between them and Dutch was not enough. I don't blame them. The beginning is directionless and difficult to power through unless you've bought into the premise of the game, which is you're an outlaw doing outlaw stuff. For every friend I have that thinks this game is a masterpiece, I have another one who dropped off in chapters 2 and 3 because it was boring. The basic loop is start a quest, ride your horse for a while to a location, hopefully with some dialogue with another character to keep things interesting, shoot some things at said location, get your money, then repeat. There's some cinematic variation with missions, but nothing more interesting gameplay-wise. So again, if you're not naturally the type of player to explore every nook and cranny of this world outside of missions, you're going to not only be wondering why we're doing this, but also insanely bored of how. See, and for a while, I chalked that up to a design issue, but it dawned on me after I finished playing that this tedium may actually be the point. The first half of the game is fighting for a way of life that's already dead, this anti-establishment Wild West fantasy, and your actions are meant to be meaningless. These crimes ultimately mean nothing and will never pay off. All they do is get the gang killed. This is how Rockstar chose to show its work through gameplay to build up the tragedy later. And while it's fascinating from a narrative perspective to create this Sisyphusian decay of the Wild West, it feels so terrible as a player and not in a way that feels like it's worth it for the payoff. What does propel the big events of the first half is Dutch. At first, he stays at camp because he's got a huge bounty on his head and he would just draw attention, but then he comes out swinging with a massacre in the town y'all have been working. So the gang runs again, and Dutch takes a much more active role this time to take advantage of a local Hatfields and McCoys feud in order to con both sides. But, of course, he takes it too far, and it just results in several friends' deaths, a kidnapping, and a much worse situation than we had before. So clearly the lesson here is that following Dutch is stupid. While the game tried every trick in the book to make you like Dutch, as the player, you may have felt weird about Dutch from the start. What Arthur saw as being Dutch's number 2, you may have seen as Dutch being far too willing to send Arthur into any deadly situation in his stead. While others speak of a code, we rarely see anyone act on it, especially Dutch. And the game's morality mechanic makes it very difficult to push an ideology through Arthur. Depending on when you started smelling Dutch's snake oil, you may have been frustrated by Arthur's loyalty long before the others clue in. If you make it to the halfway point of the game, the others do start discussing Dutch's more violent behavior amongst themselves. These schemes of his have been growing throughout the game, with the idea of more damage is worth it for bigger scores. Dutch cares less and less about who is caught in the crosshairs, betraying the gang's internal code. And this is when the seeds of doubt are sown amongst Dutch's most loyal, including Arthur. Arthur still defends Dutch to any others, but he is confused and increasingly hurt by this behavior. Keep in mind that fatal flaw we talked about earlier. Above table, you can kind of reason out why the characters have seen a change in Dutch. Hosea and Arthur have been with Dutch for at least 20 years at this point, and John for about 15. The game does explain in some blink and you'll miss it moments that Arthur came from an abusive household with a terrible father and found 2 strong, clever men in Dutch and Hosea that were capable of protecting him. Arthur, Hosea, and John have all stuck with Dutch for huge chunks of their lives, all having opportunities to get out and yet choosing to come back. Arthur is very quick to fight for Dutch when others start doubting him, saying he's the greatest man I know to justify his loyalty to the other person and by extension the player. Even those like Charles and Micah that haven't been in the gang for very long do feel admiration for Dutch. It's one of the first things they bring up. There's something intense worth fighting for, all held together by Dutch. And with how quickly these people pick up on Dutch's reported change and sour towards him, you have to infer that this behavior hasn't happened before, or at least not to this degree. At this point, they try to quietly talk some sense into Dutch because they think he's wrong, but they also know that a loss of faith in him means a loss of faith in the gang, and then all of these people they're responsible for would be left defenseless. All of this implies a genuine change in behavior from Dutch, but because the game is so dedicated to its obfuscation of the past, we don't have a real benchmark on what he was previously like, because we, the player, never know a different Dutch. Yes, you're told he was great before, and you can see he gets worse throughout the story, but everything we're told of a great Dutch has to be taken on faith. And that would be fine if your trust in Dutch matched Arthur's loyalty built on decades of trust, which is impossible with how this story is structured. And this gets harder and harder to ignore, as this is the key part of the game where the tragic fall begins, and Arthur's loyalty towards Dutch starts to catch up with him, and we see just how much Arthur gave to Dutch. But as you see Dutch become more and more of a monster, you can't help but feel frustrated. Contrast this with Yakuza Like a Dragon. Ichiban and Arthur's backstories are extraordinarily similar, actually. A young orphan boy is taken in by a charismatic gang leader with a strong code of honor and raised to be the muscle of the gang. They have a familial relationship, resulting in the boy or man being willing to do anything for the leader and the gang as a whole. And they both end up giving 20 years of their lives to the gang, but are eventually betrayed by their leader. The thing that Like a Dragon does differently is that it painstakingly shows all of that backstory in detail. I'm not advocating for 6 hours of cutscenes becoming the norm, and Like a Dragon isn't setting up a tragic fall, but there is no doubt that the player understands exactly why Ichiban is so loyal to Arakawa throughout the game, even after being betrayed by him. Because we've seen Arakawa love Ichiban and understand his sense of honor. The player is just as confused as Ichiban when he's met with a gunshot after serving 20 years in prison on his behalf. Maybe the player doesn't fully trust Arakawa, but you can understand the fact that Ichiban is exactly the kind of character to have that blind loyalty because you've seen his past. We already talked about how a big element of tragedy is that the audience knows it's coming. You have to slowly watch that tragic hero self-destruct as a consequence of their own actions and know that there's nothing you can do to stop it. In plays or books, this dynamic between audience and hero is passive, as there's nothing the audience can do to change that hero's tragic outcome, which is a big way that the story is able to create that healthy catharsis as you feel the grief of the hero from the safety of behind the fourth wall. Now, you could argue that because tragedy tends to create a level of distance between the tragic hero and the audience, it's okay for Arthur's loyalty to Dutch to not mirror the players. But games are a completely different medium. You have a direct hand in this tragedy and make those same mistakes along with the hero. In many ways, you're no longer part of the audience. You're the one up on stage playing Lear shouting into the storm. You have to step into the shoes of the tragic hero and realize that a tragic hero always thinks that they're right until the very end. Lear thinks himself a mighty enough king and father to justify his pride. Hamlet stews in indecision because accusing your uncle of killing your father is a huge deal, and making sure you're right makes sense. Gatsby and Daisy and Romeo and Juliet are all victims of young forbidden love gone wrong, but that is something that's worth fighting for. The tragic hero has to think that they're right until the consequences of their actions prove otherwise. So as the player, your loyalty to Dutch needs to mirror Arthur's from beginning to end for this betrayal to have the kind of effect it should. You need to be betrayed right alongside Arthur, but the game doesn't do the groundwork to ensure that you believe in Dutch. Think about The Last of Us Part 2. Ellie isn't quite a tragic heroine, but she does follow a similar path where she sacrifices everything in her life to feed into her fatal flaw of wrath. She commits horrible acts of violence in the name of her revenge for Joel's murder. And while you may be horrified by that brutality, it's easy to rage alongside her because Joel is someone you likely also love, and you were just as heartbroken as Ellie when he was murdered. And that feeling is not by accident. It's from a highly orchestrated emotional buildup from a dev team that micromanaged every second of these games. Funnily enough, The Last of Us Part 2 also shows how that disconnect of emotional buy-in feels when it switches you over to Abby, someone with the exact same reasons on paper as Ellie to take revenge, some jerk killed her dad, but who the audience has a viscerally difficult time playing as at first because it just feels so wrong to play as someone who you disagree with so thoroughly. Now, I stand by my argument that the first half of the game fails to set up Dutch and Arthur in a meaningful way. However, what it does get right is building relationships with side characters. Hosea, Charles, Sadie, Javier, Susan, Tilly, and John all shine in the beginning in their own ways. You do start to feel like the gang is a family when you do slow down, walk around camp, check in on everyone, sit by the fire with them, eavesdrop on their conversations with each other. These characters all have main quest missions that you're meant to go on that give them opportunities to talk and show their characters in endearing ways. You can't avoid them. It's almost like if you take the time to show meaningful relationship building between characters, the audience will be more invested in what happens to them. Shocker! Then in the second half of the game, one by one, these people that you've come to love die. The only ones that survive being those that chose to abandon the gang or betray you and stick with Dutch for the next game. This is what good setup and payoff looks and feels like. I don't feel the loss of Dutch as a leader like Arthur does, but I felt every bit of that gut punch when Hosea fell to the Pinkertons. The second half of the game is finally the unraveling that you've seen coming for far too long. The security of Arthur's world is stripped away bit by bit as his family disintegrates. Even his one asset in life, his strength, is eroded by tuberculosis. Arthur gave up a civilian life twice to stay with the gang, and now his home is ripping apart. And Rockstar does a beautiful job covering this loss. The longer a character lasts, the more you feel it when they're killed. You feel slower and weaker as consumption eats away at Arthur, his coughs growing more and more haggard as his time shortens. It's pretty brilliant, actually. You always think of your player character as invincible because death for them is inconsequential to us. Death suddenly becomes very real for Arthur and the player as we slowly march toward his doom together. But even with all this, he still can't shake that loyalty to Dutch, who, by the way, shows very little concern for the fact that Arthur is dying. Though it isn't even actually Dutch that Arthur doesn't trust, it's Micah. See, Micah is a newer addition to the gang who has somehow completely earned Dutch's trust. We are introduced to him as a trigger-happy psycho who will kill for killing's sake, something that every other character can see and finds him creepy for. It's not a coincidence that as Dutch gets more reckless, he takes Micah into closer and closer confidence, eventually replacing Arthur entirely. Arthur isn't really convinced that Dutch is evil. He blames Micah for corrupting Dutch and leading the gang towards ruin. That doesn't absolve Dutch of guilt, though. He decides to kill an old woman in cold blood, which is a huge violation of his own code. He repeatedly leaves John to die when jobs go bad, and even abandons Arthur for dead, shattering the illusion of him caring for his family's safety. He manipulates everyone around him he deems lesser than to be a pawn in his scheme, which, actually always kind of was his shtick, but I guess this is worse than it used to be. Those around him wonder, has Dutch truly changed, or is this who Dutch has always been? But we already broke down why this is probably a new thing. A tragic hero always realizes their fault at the end. Moments before their death, they cry out to whoever is left and ask for absolution, decrying their past misdeeds.
But what about loyalty? Be loyal to what matters.
Arthur's awareness of death comes a bit earlier as his disease eats him alive. It makes Arthur rethink everything he's done recently and reckon with how he wants to leave things with the gang. So he tries to be better. Arthur takes actions to undermine Dutch's attempts to use the conflict between the local Wapiti tribe and the army as a smokescreen for more money. He plots with Sadie to get the Marstons out safely. He tries to make amends with those he's wronged if you're playing White Hat. Yet, he still can't buck his loyalty. When asked, we do have to follow Dutch's plans to blow up the bridge and attack the army. This may be the core flaw of a tragic video game. On one hand, the writers want to indulge in the catharsis of tragedy and let the audience watch Arthur self-destruct by staying with Dutch. But because the player is actively having to take these actions, it's harder to go along that path with the tragic hero since by now us and Arthur are so convinced that Dutch and Micah are wrong. So Rockstar chose a middle ground. Arthur goes against Dutch when he's not around, but usually can't bring himself to openly oppose Dutch when they're face to face. The two objectives are diametrically opposed, making some of those final missions feel pretty icky, both to Arthur but especially the player. It's cutting off one's nose to spite one's face to work against Dutch in one mission and then commit some pretty major crimes for him immediately after. However, the end does thread the needle between the two, or at least the one I got. Arthur helps John and his family escape, fending off the Pinkertons that have finally descended on the camp. Micah turns up and tries to take advantage of the chaos to kill Arthur. As Arthur is nearly beaten, Dutch appears and pauses the fight. Arthur begs him to abandon Micah, insisting he's a rat who's been betraying the gang and feeding information to the Pinkertons. He pleads to the man who he loves more than anyone and admits his fault. I gave you all I had. Even in the end, even after the lies and the betrayal, Arthur still wants to save Dutch. He tries to explain his change of heart with John made it. I tried, in the end I did.
In the end, I did.
He doesn't care about Dutch Vanderland, the criminal. He just wants his hero to live up to his expectations. He never works against Dutch out of anger or spite. Every decision he made was rooted in love and loyalty to the greatest man he ever knew, trying to save him from himself. And in the end, Dutch listens, leaving both of them behind. Micah flees soon after, and as the sun rises, Arthur breathes his last, free of the gang for the first time. The tragic hero always dies in the end, leaving the side characters left alive to carry on their tale, hopefully having learned the lesson that the hero couldn't. For Red Dead Redemption 2, John Marston is the one to carry on Arthur's legacy in the epilogue, similar to Horatio, Edgar, or Cassio in Shakespeare. He did what Arthur couldn't. He saw Dutch's lack of loyalty and was able to leave on his own terms. It's by far the happiest part of the game, as John builds a civilian life with his family and those that were able to escape the Vanderland gang. By definition, a tragic hero doesn't find redemption. Their mistakes due to their fatal flaw catch up to them just as they realize their fault, leaving just enough time for one last monologue before they die. And in one way, Arthur never really overcame his flaw. He tried to help Dutch until the end, but he is fondly remembered. You can go around the world as John and hear how influential Arthur's actions were. It's not Dutch that inspired loyalty and admiration in the end. It's Arthur. Arthur isn't always a good man, but his illness gave him the perspective to take a shot at redemption in the end, and by most accounts, he took it. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a triumph in many ways. It's a marvel of environmental art. Its smaller character moments are ones that gamers will think about for years after seeing them. It's a world that does truly feel alive, which makes its narrative shortcomings that much more bitter. Player loyalty can't be bought by faith alone, but even if Dutch didn't earn our loyalty, the tragic fall of Arthur Morgan did.
Someone's gotta tell the tale, whether or not it turns out well. Maybe it will turn out this time on the road to hell in the railroad line. It's a sad song. It's a sad tale, it's a tragedy, it's a sad song. We're gonna sing it anyway.